The history of Russia is one of oppression and agitation. Not once in history have the Russian people been presided over by an entirely democratic government. In that sense, the Russian Revolution was perhaps the reaction to centuries of authoritarianism, an eventuality of a long build-up of tension. The First World War, although decisively important, was not the sole cause of revolution. What it provided was an opportunity for a provisional government to overthrow the Tsars, and the Bolsheviks to overthrow them in turn. Therefore, the war did not directly cause the Socialist Revolution, but brought about conditions that made the revolution possible. However, it's important to first understand the context of Russian society. The Russian context. By the turn of the 20th century, Russia was one of the most authoritarian states in the world. The Tsar, or Emperor, held absolute power. The country maintained an almost feudal social hierarchy. The nobility and aristocracy lived extravagant lives in the nation's largest cities, while upwards of 80% of the population were considered peasants and lived in the countryside. For decades, dissidents against the Tsarist regime were arrested and sent to Siberian work camps or executed. Intellectuals took part in underground social circles to discuss forbidden texts and ideas. These include literary pieces criticizing the monarchy, socialist precepts, and ideas for reform. Vladimir Lenin, who would later lead the radical Bolsheviks in revolution, was in exile due to this political crackdown. Being a well-known socialist, he was forced to flee to Switzerland. The prelude to war. It's essential to understand that the decade or so before World War I caused more change in Russian society than the many decades that had come prior. To some degree, this can be attributed to Tsar Nicholas II, the young ruler of Russia who was only coronated in 1896. He was widely seen as a weak and incompetent ruler by the Russian people. As he himself said, "I am not yet ready to be Tsar. I know nothing of the business of ruling." Often he was indecisive when strong leadership was necessary and was overbearing when it was not necessary. 1904 saw the outbreak of the contentious Russo-Japanese War, where Russian interests in northern China were perceived as a threat to Japan, and conflict ensued. By this time, Russia was considered one of the foremost military powers in the world. It fielded a large army and strong navies in 3 separate seas. One of these, the Russian Far East Fleet, was all but destroyed at the start of the war by a Japanese surprise attack. Afterwards, the Tsar himself insisted that the Baltic Fleet be redeployed. Against the advice of his general staff, it sailed around the world, only to be met with a decisive defeat and destruction. On the land, the Japanese won battle after battle and forced the Russians onto the defensive. By the end of the conflict, Russia had lost not only the war, but 2 of its 3 naval fleets, and its military reputation had been deeply sullied. For the people, the defeat was a bitter reminder of Tsarist incompetence and compounded a growing resentment towards the regime. In 1905, a peaceful procession of working-class individuals marched towards the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, the Tsar's residence. They intended to present a petition calling for reforms such as limitations on state officials' power, improvements to working conditions and hours, and the introduction of a national parliament called a Duma. The crowd was met with gunfire. Several hundred protesters were killed or wounded. Even though the Tsar was not actually in residence at the time and did not give the order to fire on the protesters, he was widely blamed for a lack of control. This incident, known as Bloody Sunday or Red Sunday, caused the 1905 Russian Revolution, the precursor to the Socialist Revolution of 1917. The 1905 revolution was initiated by sentiments from the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, but it was severely aggravated by Bloody Sunday. The revolution itself consisted of strikes, civil unrest, and military mutinies. It accomplished its goals, and in 1906 a new constitution was adopted. It adhered to the protesters' demands for an elected parliament and political pluralism. What is important about this revolution is not necessarily that it accomplished its goals, but that it signifies that the Russian people believed that change was possible. The 1905 revolution can be seen as a blueprint for the later 1917 revolution. Lenin himself called it the Great Dress Rehearsal, without which the victory of the October Revolution in 1917 would have been impossible. For the Russian government, it seemed as if the unrest had been resolved. Unfortunately, it had only been temporarily abated. Russia in conflict. When Russia joined the First World War in 1914, it did so in hopes of protecting Serbia. It had been promoting the ideals of Pan-Slavism, that there is a unified Slavic culture. to gain influence in the Balkans. It also sought to recover the military reputation it had lost to Japan, and so it set out with an agenda. However, once Russia began engaging in combat with Germany, a few things became abundantly clear. Firstly, the chain of command was militarily incompetent. From the most basic field officers to the general staff at large, the army faced institutional inefficiency. Thus, it seemed as if the military had not learned its lesson from the Russo-Japanese War. And secondly, it was badly equipped. In every regard, there was a lack of equipment such as rifles, artillery pieces, shells, motorized transports, and even boots. As General Denikin, the commander of the Battle of Galicia, said, "The German heavy artillery swept away whole lines of trenches and their defenders with them. We hardly replied. There was nothing with which we could reply. Our regiments, although completely exhausted, were beating off one attack after another by bayonet." Against an outstandingly well-equipped German military, the Russians stood little chance. Poorly planned and executed offensives resulted in mass casualties. For example, the Russian offensive at the Battle of Tannenberg, one of the first battles on the Eastern Front, resulted in the annihilation of the Russian Second Army and the suicide of its commanding general, Alexander Samsonov. In only the first month of the war, this battle cost 200,000 casualties and POWs for Russia. Over time, the war took its toll on the Russian army, and the soldiers began to lose their hope in a victory. Problems with morale were so severe that many soldiers simply laid down their arms and refused to fight anymore. Mutinies, often against officers, were common, and by 1917, upwards of 300,000 Russian troops had deserted. While the soldiers blamed their direct commanding officers, a growing resentment for the Tsarist regime took hold. Nicholas II was despised for his incompetence, and the troops blamed their peers' deaths on him. Revolutionary sentiments were rearing their head again for the first time since 1905. The Socialist Revolution. Contrary to popular belief, it was not the Bolsheviks that forced the Tsar out of power. If anything, they had very little to do with the end of the monarchy. Instead, it ended with the February Revolution, as it's called. This revolution closely echoed the events of 1905. In early 1917, protests began in St. Petersburg as the people demanded bread and other living necessities that had been forgotten during the war. Nervous army garrisons fired on the growing crowds and killed protesters. However, they continued to demonstrate. A day later, the Duma, the elected parliament, declared a provisional government separate from the Tsarist regime, and the chairman of the Duma, Mikhail Rodionko, sent a telegram to Nicholas saying, "The situation is serious. The capital is in a state of anarchy. The government is paralyzed. Transport service and the supply of food and fuel have become completely disrupted. General discontent is growing." Seeing no other way to end the chaos, Tsar Nicholas II, who was in the field commanding, abdicated, ending centuries of monarchy. The provisional government put forward radical reforms for liberties, including freedom of speech, equity before the law, and others. However, if the provisional government made one mistake, it was that they elected to remain in the war. By this point, the country was entirely fed up with the war, and although content with the Tsarist regime's departure, resentment for Nicholas was quickly replaced with resentment for the new government. Meanwhile, Vladimir Lenin, who was still in exile in Switzerland, heard the news of the downfall of the Tsarist regime. He immediately made plans to return to Russia. He figured that he would be able to assume the leaders of the radical Bolsheviks and lead them to revolution. In October, they did just that, and in one action stormed the Winter Palace where government officials were and overthrew the provisional government. The debate around the October Revolution is often stonewalled by one particular idea, that it wasn't actually a revolution. Although it was becoming increasingly unpopular, the provisional government had returned the country to stability and attempted to make improvements to Russia. When the Bolsheviks overthrew the government, it was far more akin to a coup than a revolution. A political party occupied the government's offices and parliament and declared that they were in charge. By no means is this a revolution. The Marxist historian's idea that the revolution was undertaken on behalf of the people also lacks evidence. By every conceivable sense, it was a coup undertaken by the Bolsheviks for the Bolsheviks. The only thing that they did which was in the interest of the people was their promise to pull out of the war. They knew that without any popular support their coup would fail, so they gave hope to the country by promising an end to the conflict. This made them immensely popular, and it was a key factor in the success of the Bolshevik coup. The Bolsheviks consolidated their promise to end the war by agreeing to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. It ceded massive amounts of land and was a great source of humiliation for them. However, the effects of the coup were only just taking hold. Growing resistance to the Bolsheviks developed into an alliance of remaining provisional government officials, army officers, and the soldiers loyal to the Tsar, initiating a war. They became known as the Whites, and while often described as a pro-Tsarist force, they were closer to an anti-Bolshevik force. The Bolsheviks themselves became known as the Reds and defended their position in power. This is known as the Russian Civil War. It was an exceptionally bloody conflict that saw millions of casualties, mostly civilians. It is important to note that during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks decided that the Tsar and his family, who had been worriedly watching the events unfold in Russia, should be killed. This was in order to stop them falling into pro-Tsarist forces. Thus, Nicholas, his wife, and all of his children were shot in a basement by Red Army officers. This event left a horrible mark on the Bolsheviks' already limited legitimacy and reputation. The historical debate. The debate around the Russian Revolution and the lead up to its events is marred with controversy. Opinions about the revolution are mixed. On the one hand are the liberal conservatives that argue that the Bolsheviks acted in only their own interests, suppressing the people as the Tsars did before them. On the other hand are the classical Soviet historians who argue it was a revolution entirely for and by the people, with Lenin as its figurehead. But both arguments miss out on the crucial events leading to the outbreak of revolution. The war was undoubtedly the main catalyst for the downfall of the Tsars, but when considering the nature of the Bolsheviks' overthrow of the provisional government, the story changes. In reality, the war led to a provisional government, not the Bolshevik coup. It was only several months after the fact that they took power, exposing the fallacy in the idea of the socialist revolution against the Tsar. It is vital to understand that the Bolsheviks had almost nothing to do with Nicholas's downfall. Instead, they found the opportunity in the provisional government's weakness and their popularity for promising to pull out of the war. Revisionist historians take the revolution as a whole to be a farce. They assert that the Bolsheviks fraudulently declared that they overthrew the monarchy, setting the stage for the later Soviet culture of covering up failures to seem more appealing. The early days of the Soviet Union were built on an array of lies and deception. The Bolsheviks proclaimed themselves as the triumphant vanquishers of an evil regime, yet they simultaneously continued the means of oppression. They pretended to be proponents of democracy while undermining any advances made in 1905 and 1917. But most importantly, they claimed to be of the people while really they only acted in their own political interests. Conclusion. The Russian experience in World War I was undoubtedly a profound factor in the outbreak of revolution. However, the war was not the source of Russia's troubles. They began long before. It was only after centuries of authoritarian rule that the people gained some modicum of liberty after the revolution of 1905. And yet it would last only 12 years. As the Bolsheviks took and then consolidated power, they did not end the Tsarist authoritarianism. They merely replaced it. World War I did not cause the people to rise up against the regime, as Soviet historians may believe. It was only the opportunity for the Bolsheviks to assume their place on as the new authoritarian power. And here are the paintings used.